Today in our panel discussion, we have we have Dr. Evan Adams. He's a family physician from the Tualamin First Nation near Powell River, British Columbia, and he's also Chief Medical Officer with the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. We have Dr. Onye Nnorom, who's a physician, advocate, public speaker, and leader in the field of public health and equity. She's also a family doctor and public health and preventative medicine specialist, as well as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Dr. Nnorom's expertise lies at the intersection of anti-racism, community health, and healthcare transformation. Our third panelist is Dr. Michael Kirlew, who has a family practice in the Winnebago Area Health Authority, and he teaches at Nnorom, at Queen's University, and the University of Ottawa. He's committed to raising awareness of and dismantling systemic racism in healthcare to improve outcomes for affected populations. Our moderator for this panel will be Dr. Alika Lafontaine. Welcome, everyone, and over to you, Dr. Lafontaine.
Thank you, Shika. Start with Evan, and if it's okay, I'll use first names with everyone on the panel. Evan, you've been in and working on as a leading voice reconciliation within healthcare for your entire career, provincially, locally, nationally, internationally. You've had the opportunity to see the problem from multiple different sides. Really take a thoughtful look at it. I'll also just let the attendees tonight know that Evan's a very popular actor in Indian country as well. If you haven't seen Smoke Signals, really encourage you to. It's a cult classic, one of my favorite movies. He's one of the lead characters. And, just bringing together all those experiences, like connecting with people in not just medicine, but outside in film and theater and other things, and really understanding the human experience. What's some thoughts that you have about how we move from where we're at right now with reconciliation to where we need to be, and how would you communicate to attendees tonight, where you feel like we're at right now and what it will look like to be where we need to go?
Thanks, Alika. And I'm really glad to be here and to talk about this, showing up in a good way. And I'm very purposely staying at a very high level. We could stay at a low level of commitment, like, oh, my office will create a pamphlet about Aboriginal health. But of course, I'm much more interested in someone who wants to maybe take bigger steps. And Indigenous people have been here for a long time. Lots of physicians are strong leaders, very principled, broad experiences, generally very well educated, generally very bright. So I feel like they can go quite a long way compared to Joe Canadian. Like I mean that. So I do want to speak at a higher level. We could list actions, but I really want to go more towards principles. I say I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt. I'm going to Hawaii soon for a year of research at the John A. Burns School of Medicine. And it will be my turn to be an uninvited guest in Indigenous lands. And I remember the first time I went to Hawaii, I was with a cohort of physicians who were going to be working in Hawaii. And I remember the moderator saying, "You're in Hawaii. Health here is very different. And we serve tens of millions of tourists. Yes, but we also serve Hawaiians." And they meant we serve Native Hawaiians. And you knew you were going to be serving Native Hawaiians, right? And we were looking around at each other. And of course, I said, yes, of course. I'm so eager to help where I can help to be of service. And the others are, oh, Native Hawaiians. So I wonder what that will be like. I'm the son of two residential school survivors. My mother was in a TB hospital for 2 years, from when she was 5 until she was 7. Even though she didn't have TB, her father did. Her father didn't get to go to the TB hospital. He died from TB while she was in residential school, like 5 years after they took her to put her in the TB hospital. Part of my work in reconciliation is to reconcile that journey. It's very hard to think about that. And who would do that? Who would institutionalize children? Who would isolate children? Who would experiment on children? Who would be callous about Indigenous people? And really all I can conclude is that, they didn't see our humanity. we were things, and I feel like I need to appeal to citizens, to the people here, to doctors, but I feel like they know it very well. There's a humanity in there. So please, let's really try and do our best for Indigenous people. And I can't believe that I've spent so much of my career saying Indigenous people deserve our care. Please don't leave them out. Please don't be negligent in looking after them. Uh, my hope has always been that medicine and the health system and doctors would help with improving Indigenous health in Canada. We have the worst health of anyone in the country. I trained as a family doctor, and it took me a long time to understand that I had a really good understanding of family. And I had to develop my idea of doctor. And I feel like sometimes as doctors, we forget that we serve not just individual patients, but communities, and that we actually have a responsibility to to the multicultural success story and the sophistication that is Canada. I've learned a lot from seeing other countries and how they deal with their Indigenous peoples. There are lessons there, like literal lessons where you have to go and read what's happening in those other countries. So I encourage our um, physician colleagues to do exactly that. I would love for us to learn more about anti-Indigenous racism. It's very strange. Here in my hometown, the English name is Powell River. The pushback against renaming places so they have Indigenous names again is just extraordinary and appalling to me. When we're speaking to ordinary citizens about reconciliation, they'll say very mean-spirited things. They won't show up in a good way, saying things like, well, you all didn't have a writing system, so your knowledges are inferior. We lost the war, so now we own all of the land. We think you're exaggerating about those babies and those residential school graves. And we go down rabbit holes where I'm having to educate and beg for compassion. Like, could you not be crass about what happened to these children? And be a person, like a legitimate partner, like in a family, where you show up and say, I'm going to do my part and not be a jerk. I think reconciliation is really about something easy to say and hard to do, which is equity of service, equity of outcomes. And I think physicians need to embrace their old role as community leaders, as examples to their communities of kindness and service and a helping hand, and as thought leaders and people who can show others a better way of being. And of course, we need to include our Indigenous physician colleagues in Indigenous competencies, Indigenous knowledge systems, including knowledge keepers and the like. And I think I'm going to stop there. Our last session, I just heard some really wonderful thoughts, but mostly I had such a good feeling from people. And I hope that this group has brought that same good feeling. Thanks.
Thanks, Evan. We'll bring Onye into this. You obviously bring your own history, of oppression and advocacy. And, as you listen to Evan's conversation, as you think about our conversation that we had a couple nights back, what are you thinking about tonight as far as how you define where we're at right now with reconciliation and where it is that we need to go?
So I think, that's a challenging question as far as where we're at. I don't know that I am in a position as a non-Indigenous person to say where we're at, but as you said, as a non-Indigenous person who has a history of colonization, of slavery, and intergenerational experiences of structural oppression, both on this land and beyond. As far as my ancestry, I think that I'll kind of just focus on the fact that I think this is a wonderful opportunity and it's history in the making. That's what I'm always reminding my colleagues when we do work, whether I'm being an ally and supporting work with regards to truth and reconciliation and looking at ourselves and doing that deep reflection, which includes for Black people and people of color, reflecting on how we contribute intentionally, unintentionally, overtly, and covertly to colonial practices, to anti-Indigenous racism ourselves, right? Being the recipient of racism and oppression does not preclude you from actually inflicting that on others. So you have to actually do that work within yourself in a different way than I would say white settlers need to, because it's often the excuse is, well, I've experienced racism, so I don't need to learn about your history or be part of that work, or I'm already somehow an ally without having done that deep work that you talked about, Alika, the deep work at looking at our own history. And I think about what I don't want to steal Michael's thunder, but in the last one said that we've all been steeped in colonialism, right? So we have to think about how those influences have impacted us as Black people, people of color, as non-Indigenous people, towards truth and reconciliation. So I think that's one. It's important to do the work, and we're at a time in history where I could say, at least in medicine, that I meet people who are doing the work. I'm meeting folks who are of European descent, really self-identifying as settlers and understanding the history. So I think in that sense, to see that kind of change, it is a beautiful thing. I think sometimes where we are in situations like what Evan described, and sometimes the pushback that we're also seeing in medicine, it's very real in medicine and in society against equity, against decolonization, like any of this work in EDI, anti-racism work, then it can feel like a nightmare. So the whole thing sometimes can feel like a beautiful nightmare in a way. So you see the beauty of people coming together, but at the same time, you see these what feels like emotional violence. That's the way I would interpret what Evan is describing, where people are denying the cruelty that Indigenous children experienced, right? Um, like I can't fully fathom that. Like that is, especially when it has to do with children, just the great level of dehumanization. So that still exists. I think for me, I ground myself in looking to the future and positivity, because sometimes we can get kind of really wrapped up in the challenges. We have to talk about the challenges, but then, it's like, okay, well, what do we do? And so there's two things I would say, when it comes to those who want to do this work, especially when you're in a position of acting as ally, right? Like the way I have in my roles in supporting, the work to address anti-Indigenous racism or decolonial work with my colleagues in cultural safety. I think it's really important to the example I use is you thinking about when you're a medical student, you're trying to do the arterial blood gas, right? And so you have to kind of do the work. You have to study. You have to do your due diligence. You don't just kind of walk around the ward with a needle ready to inflict that on somebody. You do the work. You read. In this example, let's say doing like the cultural safety training, different types of learning and understanding, and also understanding like Indigenous like strength and sovereignty and solidarity and art and like beauty and resistance and all of those things. But learning, and then with the help and of colleagues who are more advanced than you, getting into the action, as you put it, right? So the reconciliation. And so what that means is that you also in that process might make mistakes, and it's that, you want that fight or flight kind of, reaction can happen. And I think in medicine, the way we get over that, when you're going to do an arterial blood gas for the first time, it might not work, but you're committed to learning because you want to save a patient's life. And when you do perhaps make a mistake and you poke a few times, that patient does not have to forgive you or say thank you for your bravery or whatever. No, they might be very ticked off at you, actually. But you stay committed to that work because you want to be a good doctor, because you realize that you want to save people's lives. You, with humility, apologize and you learn from your mistakes and try to do better because you know that it's critically important. You don't just say, well, I'm just not going to learn arterial blood gas. I might make a mistake. So I think it's the same thing with this work. Racism kills patients, right? Through either assumptions made about patients, the violence towards patients, or sometimes it's just the plain neglect and the dehumanization and lack of empathy. Joyce Echaquan is just the tip of the iceberg of these examples. So you have to understand that you have to do this work so that you can help your patients ultimately. The second thing is keeping patience with this work. So for those of us doing it, it can feel really heavy. And I know people said stuff about colleagues not supporting. And the only thing that I use as my coping mechanism is I remember when I was at McGill as a medical student, we were in the C. diff crisis. So Clostridium difficile, lots of patients were dying. They were teaching the doctors to wash their hands more. And I kid you not, there was resistance. They were saying, oh, it's going to slow us down when we do our rounds. Like just change, any kind of change like that, which was microbiology, right? And patient lives. There was so much resistance in the older docs, but for us who were medical students at the time, they were like working on us to wash our hands. And I feel like that stuck. So sometimes with this work, it's also like people who are more senior have to do so much unlearning, and that can be a challenge. But for me, I keep my eyes on the future and I really invest in young people, and the change does happen, like, over time. So Evan said policy, we need those policies sometimes to force people to do those change. We need structural change. But for those who are younger coming up, it becomes their norm and they don't question it as much in their. So I think those are two things that keep me motivated and willing to keep going, even if I might make mistakes and even if change is slow. So those are my two kind of key points.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. We'll bring Mike into this. For any of you who do a bit of internet sleuthing on Mike Kirlew, you'll realize that he was into podcasting before podcasting became a thing. So, Mike, maybe what I'll ask you as a slight variation on the question is, you've been a part of these longer conversations. We all have had conversations, but podcasts give you a special opportunity to really capture those verbatim, so it's not just your memory of what you talked about, but actually looking at what you talked about. And I'm just wondering, as you've had those longer conversations over time, how have you seen the attitude for reconciliation change? And then your opinion, like, is it bringing us closer to where we need to go, further apart? And this is all appreciating that we're in a very dynamic time in medicine right now. Like we were making, I think, a lot of good progress with reconciliation. And I mean, you're hearing from both Evan and Onye, there is a bit of a swing back from where we're going, that there is more resistance than there maybe was before. So just turn it over to you.
Yeah, I would agree that I think now there is definitely more spaces to have this conversation. I remember just even 10 or 15, 20 years ago when I started, just even the concept of something like systemic racism or colonization, those were foreign terms in medical school, right? Like I remember hearing those terms for the first time in medical school, and it was very defensive. You know what I mean? That first encounter. So I think over time there's more space to have those conversations. I think about the insidious effects of colonization, and that colonization is something that if you don't get at it, it's not going to go away. It's just going to morph into a form that's more palatable for this generation, right? And I find that sometimes, yes, there might be these spaces that seem to be more inclusive and want to have these conversations, but they still sometimes can be paralyzed by sort of a what do we do, right? And you don't really see, as we say, a lot of those action points. You know what I mean? That can, or sometimes these spaces don't involve, I find, still the communities in which they're trying to serve, right? So those community voices are not really at the table, right? So it's interesting. Sometimes you'll have these conversations and there'll be no community representation at the table that you're talking about, right? So I find that overall, I think that there is, there isn't a general acceptance to have these conversations. I think though that there still is resistance. There's no question, it's there still is that resistance to sort of have these difficult conversations. Change can only happen with difficult conversations. Change is never a comfortable process. And I find that sometimes we need to be committed to the uncomfort of engaging in a process. I can say I'm committed to a process. The question is, am I committed to the intrinsic sort of, I'm not going to feel well in that process. It's going to be uncomfortable. Can I commit to that? Right? It's easy to commit to the tenets of, let's say, fairness. But if it comes to me giving up something I want to give to somebody else to make it fair, that's really the question that we have to think about, right? So it's engaging in these uncomfortable dialogues. You know what I mean? That really, that's how we get that growth, right? We need to be able to have these conversations, and at times, because of the insidious sort of effects of colonization, systems and structures are not built to take those conversations and have them germinate into action.
Yeah, I really like how you describe that, and this makes me think about the CMA in its journey. In September we're going to have the apology event, which is a lot different than I think the TRC. The TRC spent several years collecting stories, organizing them, really having the opportunity for people to share in forums. The apology from the CMA is really like the first page in what could become like a TRC movement where people reflect and investigate their history.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to you, Evan, I know when the TRC was coming through each of the places that it did in Canada, you were asked to be an honorary witness. And you probably, out of the four of us, had the deepest firsthand experience with that sort of process. What type of advice do you have um, as someone who's on the inside, as someone who stood beside witnesses, as an honorary witness, kind of being, using that word, steeped in the trauma of what was going on, of that sharing? Can you share a bit about what that was like? Help people to understand something that may be tough for them to understand.
Oh, thanks, Alika. I've actually very seldom spoken about what it was like to be an honorary witness, to hear survivors talk about, these state-sanctioned human rights abuses against them as children, now as adults. It was utterly harrowing to hear those, but I think every Canadian should hear them. It was, one of the most egregious parts of Canadian history ever. There have been TRCs in Chile and Argentina, in South Africa, state-sanctioned human rights abuses against portions of their population. Like, just horrible things occurred under those, I don't even know what to call them, in those situations. So the amount of time that it took, the amount of processing that it took, the amount of, like, it was just physical work to sit and hear someone say, this is what happened to me. Yeah, it was just lots of crying, sorry. But very humanizing. And so I feel like, I became a better person because of it. But I also maybe became angrier because, when someone doesn't have that knowledge and they say stupid things like, oh, did those children really die? I think, maybe not. And you just want to say, I think a normal person would say, what happened to those children? And not center yourselves as, an ignorant bystander with a very vague, uninformed opinion. Like, you think you'd have some humility and you would say, yeah, I'm a person. I would like to know what happened to people when, these terrible things were happening. So, yeah, it, it was painful to have my parents go through that process. My father never completed his statement, to have my mother make her statement and to see her cry for months as she prepared. And yeah, I feel really protective of them. You know, I'm a person of profound privilege. I'm as privileged as any physician here. I don't have anything to complain about as far as, you know, personal experience, but you know, my parents definitely deserve better. And there are so many of our patients, Indigenous patients, who deserve better. And I feel like we should help. And so I think the apology is not about pointing fingers at physicians and their deficits. I think it's about saying, you know, we had a collective responsibility, and we were, you know, absent at our posts, or this occurred under our watch, and even some of us did some terrible things. Uh, you know, around forced and coerced sterilization, or around medical experimentation, around neglect in emergency rooms, racist comments against our patients, toxic work environments that we led. We can do a lot to say, let's just do better.
Thanks for sharing that, Evan. You know, Anya, you've, I think, walked thousands of steps beside people going through trauma, you know, as someone who has advocated for equity deserving groups, you know, First Nation, Métis, Inuit, Black, Asian, other racialized communities, or those who have experienced, you know, the multitude of other isms, you know, sexism, classism, ableism, etc. Um, you know, as you reflect on, you know, all those experiences you've had walking beside people, you know, and you know, your own memories of having people walk beside you, right? As you've kind of gone through things. What types of things do you think about as far as what makes a good ally? You know, what makes a person more effective at walking with someone as they go through that?
Yeah, um, I think there's many different ways that I've experienced it and tried to embody being a good ally. And I say try because, as I mentioned before, it's not a performance of perfection. It's like you're doing your best. And depending on where I was in my journey of unlearning, and I'm still on my journey of unlearning and learning, there's different types of, like I said, things that went well and things that didn't. And the same for people who walked with me. And I think sometimes we need to have compassion when we can. Sometimes we just can't. Like sometimes we're angry and we should be angry, right? Like, I mean, you have the right to be angry. We have the right to be angry when we need to be angry. But when we have space for that compassion, or we see that somebody's coming with good intention, that's important to recognize when we can. What that's looked like for me, I would, maybe because of my African ancestry, I see it kind of as a dance. So it's like sometimes it's necessary for me to step forward, a moment for me to speak up, and because there might not be Indigenous folks, or you know, if it's another group that I'm trying to be an ally for in that room, in that boardroom, at that table, at that family picnic, like whatever the context is, then I need to step forward. And speak up, I feel. Where I am with somebody and something happens, then again, there's that dance, because maybe I need to step back and they can handle it on their own. Maybe they're having that fight or flight reaction and I need to lightly, not overstep, but ask like what I would call a curious question, like one of those, well, what did you mean by that? Right? To the person who said whatever thing I thought was offensive, but it's not my place to go full out or take over the situation. I need to decenter myself. And then there's times where sometimes it's going to be so explosive, it's better to be quiet and then just check in with the person afterwards and be like, are you okay? What can I do? What can we do? Do you want me to do something? Do you want me to put you in touch with somebody who has walked this, more directly as an Indigenous leader or something, you know what I mean? Or do you want me to stand with you and we do this, or both? Like, what do you need? Or do we just need to like debrief and, make fun of the people in the room a little bit and just decompress and be like, can you believe that just happened? Right. And they don't want to take it forward and they don't want to call 3 people or file a complaint. They just want to be able to have that human moment of, I see you. I see you. that was not cool. I'm validating you. And then what are you going to do now when you go home? Are you going to be okay? Do you want to check in? You know what I mean? How you feeling? And then sometimes it's working as silent uh, uh, partners to be able to covertly support each other in ways that are informal, that I can't even say here because it's just ways that we can navigate. So in anti-oppression work, we call it co-conspirators, but it's not a conspiracy, trust me. It's just working in informal ways to ensure that good things occur in a justice manner. And it's a beautiful thing, and it's a way that one can use one's power and privilege, or just not being the group that is directly harmed. And it has worked both ways. And I've had beautiful moments with my Indigenous colleagues who taught me so much about, like, even thinking of medicine as Western medicine, and reflecting on my cultural ways of addressing health and the role of the healer, and having an appreciation for Indigenous ways and approaches that I had not, had early in my medical training. So there's many beautiful ways to be able to do that. I can say that during the pandemic, we had so many beautiful ways with Indigenous physician leaders and Black physician leaders of thinking about how we can support communities in a humanistic way, in a culturally safe and affirming way, in a way that says, I see you, whether you want the vaccine or not, I see you and I'm here to support you. And so we shared and again, I would say the pandemic was that kind of thing, that kind of sharing was another kind of beautiful nightmare under the pressure, but it was ways that we were able to hold each other up. And so I try my best when I'm able to do that. And when it's, as my colleague, Dr. Marsha Anderson, who's an Indigenous leader, where it makes sense, then do we speak in chorus altogether about things that affect both of our communities? And when it doesn't make sense, do we then, like I said, a bit of that stepping back, but still hold each other up with that support, but realizing we have unique differences, and to respectfully, again, like, stand back. With that dance, every now and then I trip on myself and I have to get up and learn and say, okay, I need to do better. And that's part of the process.
Thanks for sharing that, Onye. We'll turn to Mike before moving over to the audience, and maybe just asking if folks have any questions or comments that they'd like the panel just to speak to. Mike, in 2017, 2018, you were part of of things that I've experienced or been a part of as far as communities going through crisis. The suicide pacts that spread throughout Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba. You were Dr. and Sue Lookout at the time. I remember the chats that we had together and in larger groups as part of the alliance work that we worked on together, with Saul Mamakwa and Ted Cusance and other folks within those territories. I was struck reading through some of your comments and news articles. I was kind of looking back where you talked about how the trauma sometimes felt overwhelming, and how sometimes you felt like you needed to leave for yourself, but you knew you couldn't right then because people needed you, right? Maybe you could speak a little bit about kind of this journey that we're all on for reconciliation, and the ways that you've dealt with needing to hear trauma, things that feel really heavy, and as a person who's experiencing it in a secondhand way, it's sometimes tough for us to fully acknowledge how much it affects us, because we see the person who's actually going through it, and we say to ourselves, how can I look at my needs when you're the one who's experiencing this? So maybe just centered around that sort of experience, and looking back at the things that it taught you, maybe some advice that you can share to attendees on the kind of ally that can be there during those moments when people really need you.
Yeah, it was a very I worked in a wonderful community, the community of Wapakika, Ontario. I was there for about 15 years, and in Sioux Lookout, and we had 4 beautiful girls that committed suicide in the span of about 8 months, in 2017 and 2018. The community had recognized prior to the suicides, that there were some issues, and they developed sort of a community-based plan, and they presented it to the federal government, months before the first suicide, and they were told it was a not ideal time in the funding cycle. And yeah, it was a very difficult time. I find, though, we can get our inspiration from humanity and our connection to humanity. And I remember speaking to an elder, and she said something that was very, very, very powerful. She said, we may be down now, but we're going to be up again. And she made that statement. And when you hear someone in the face of that kind of situation have that level of hope, then that is contagious. Like, it's more contagious than COVID, right? And it's amazing, to see. And it was incredible in the sense that the community worked together and came up with community-based solutions that brought down the suicide rate, and it was very, very powerful.